I'm Ross Pfeiffer, Director of the Center for Agricultural and Shale Law at Penn State Law. And we are pleased to have you back for the second day of our program. Today we have 3 sessions planned. The first session will address utility scale and community solar projects from the developer's perspective. The second session will address municipal ordinances and community issues. And the third session will look at policy and incentive issues. So really looking kind of at the current state, as well as looking forward into the future. Again, all of the materials are located on the events page of the website of the Center for Ag and Shale Law, the agenda, the PowerPoints from Tuesday as well as today, the CLE form and CLE forms and an evaluation form. So this is a screenshot of our website. You can see that we have the banner for the Solar Law Symposium. If you click on the Learn More, you will get to all the event materials, or you can click on the events page or the events tab and click on the page for the Solar Law Symposium. So with that, we will move into the substance of today's program. Our fourth session addresses utility scale and community solar projects from the developer's perspective. And our moderator for this session is Tom Murphy. Tom is the director of Penn State's Marcellus Center for Outreach and Research. Tom kicked off our program yesterday by kind of giving us that bird's eye and ground view of solar development.
As Ross had mentioned, we're trying to come at this session today, or introduce the session today, that's going to be giving a perspective from the developer's standpoint when we think about utility scale solar and community solar. And we'll define those here in just a moment, and we'll talk more about the difference between them. But again, what we're trying to do is talk about what are some of the considerations to make a project when we're talking about solar, these large solar projects in Pennsylvania. What makes them commercially viable? What are the different details that a developer looks at when they're looking at putting this actually on the ground? We also want to be thinking about where they would do them. So we're going to be talking about siting, or I should say our speakers are going to be talking about some of the siting characteristics that they're looking for very specifically when they're looking at these sites. And beyond all that, we're going to have a little bit of a discussion just briefly and talk about some of the legislative initiatives that are out there and where some of that is going, and the implications of that in the near term and the long term as we think about large scale solar development, grid scale and community solar development as it takes place here within the Commonwealth and some of the surrounding states. But our focus is going to be Pennsylvania, so we're somewhat Pennsylvania centric here, although we recognize that a lot of the comments and details would certainly apply to some of you that are representing some other states. There are 7 utility scale projects that are up and operating in Pennsylvania right now. We had a chance to view a couple of those yesterday in the virtual tour that we did. Community solar is not currently in motion in Pennsylvania, but there are some legislative initiatives that, again, you're going to hear a little bit more about that are going to address where we're trending in that regard. Our first speaker, and is represented by the slides you can see here, is Phillip Guerra. Phillip is an attorney with Forefront Power. He's also a certified professional land manager. He has done work for the oil and gas industry in that regard as well. But now he's working in the renewable space, specifically working on solar projects up and down the East Coast. Our second speaker is going to be Alyssa Edwards. And Alyssa is going to be concentrating on the utility scale solar. She's currently the Vice President for Environmental Affairs, Government Relations with Lightsource BP. Experience managing a variety of projects, but her expertise is environmental and regulatory compliance issues and working with these renewables projects, specifically with wind and solar, although we're going to concentrate on solar today. She also has expertise and will comment as well in the space of building stakeholder relations and the whole idea about social license to operate for projects like this. So the complete bios are listed on the website. As Ross mentioned, you can go there and take a look. I think you're going to see that both speakers have extensive knowledge in this capacity when we're talking about these two different types of solar arrays or initiatives, these different types of facilities. And we're going to turn it over to them and find out a little bit more about what makes these projects actually work. So we have a lot to cover, and we're going to kick in right now and go with Phillip. So Phillip, it's all yours.
Thanks, Tom. I'd like to thank everyone who's joining us. Today's presentation is solar in Pennsylvania from a developer's perspective. First and foremost, I want to thank Penn State for having me today, especially Tom Murphy and Dan Brockett. Excited to be here. What we're going to get into is when it comes to solar, what types of solar projects, to be on the lookout for, what a developer looks for when they're selecting a potential site, and then how a developer might structure an agreement with a landowner. And then I want to dive a little bit into the legislation, development, and the permitting. I need maybe 25 minutes of your time. I'm going to get out of the way there. I'm going to start with this disclaimer. I'm not an attorney, not your attorney. Everything I discuss in today's presentation today stems from my own opinions, and this is not necessarily the opinion of my employer. Don't take anything as legal advice. We'll leave it at that. All right, let's jump right in and discuss the different types of solar projects someone may see in a state like Pennsylvania. I think it's important to grasp what type of project is being proposed by the developer before jumping into site selection, negotiations, and everything else that comes after a developer obtains site control. The first question you want to ask the developer is, what type of project are you trying to build? There are two types of projects, behind the meter and front of the meter. A behind the meter project is a system that generates power or electricity that can be used on site. That's your key word there, on site, without passing through a meter. Front of the meter, or FTM, is a system that generates power or electricity to any location off-site that must pass through the meter before reaching you, the end user. So here is a residential solar project. I'm sure most of you are probably aware of this type of solar project, but this is a great example of a behind the meter or BTM project. Those panels on the roof you see there are producing power or electricity on site. It stays on site, it does not have to pass through the meter, although it's very likely that this project is still tied into the grid. My company built this project outside of Albany, New York. It is a community solar project that's roughly 15 acres or so. So that is a front of the meter project. The power being generated is going off-site. The landowner here is receiving a price per acre payment over a 20 or 30-year lease term. If the power or electricity was being used on-site to power that farm or that barn and everything you see in the picture, that would be a BTM or behind the meter project. So sometimes smaller scale projects can be both, or can be either or, behind the meter or front of the meter. Last example, here's a utility scale solar project. These projects are massive, typically covering several hundred acres per project. And that's evident by looking at this picture here. These utility scale projects are great examples of front of the meter projects. The power, electricity being generated off-site, and then you, the consumer, receive that power downstream as it passes through your meter. If you are a landowner or you're representing a landowner, again, one of the first questions you should ask the developer is, what type of project are they building or proposing? Is it behind the meter or front of the meter? Today in Pennsylvania, if a developer approaches your client or is looking to do a community solar project, which is front of the meter, compared to a utility scale project, which is also front of the meter. Again, knowing that difference, knowing that could be important. Why? Well, community solar, again, does not exist in PA right now. The legislation's not in place, and we're going to get into that here in a little bit. But my point is, if you ask the developer this question, the answer will give you some guidance as to whether the project can be built now, today, or down the road in the future. That may be important to a landowner. Community solar projects are typically smaller in size due to state legislation. The project is going to be capped, typically 20 or 30 acres. At least that's how states like New York and Maine and Virginia are handling it. But if the developer approaches your client and says they want to do a 300-acre community solar project, Well, those types of projects are capped. So it sounds like that developer has little to no experience, doing community solar, and that to me would be a red flag. The less landowners the less landowners I have to work with and deal with, the better. For example, with a community solar site capped at 30 acres, dealing with one landowner versus 3 landowners owning 10 acres each, I would prefer to go with the one landowner that has 30 acres. It's just a little easier to deal with. Looking at utility scale though, one landowner might not have the acres required by the developer. They might not have 300, 400 acres by themselves. So that's something to be aware of. Okay, selecting a potential site. As the East Coast land manager at my company, this is what I do on every single day. Every single day I do this. I want to walk this audience through what goes into my mind when I'm looking for a potential solar site. Today, my company is actively acquiring land for community solar in Pennsylvania, even though we don't have legislation in place. So I'm going to walk you guys through an example and go over the land criteria. And most of this land criteria is going to apply to utility scale as well. It just depends on what the developer's looking for. So when identifying land for, let's say, a community solar project in Pennsylvania, everything starts with the substation. Your substation is just where power or electricity, let's say from a natural gas power plant, is stepped down so it can be supplied to your home or your business. And I'm going to show you here a picture here in a minute of a substation. The first thing I'm looking for though is the substation. We want to be within a certain distance, let's say within 2 or 3 miles. The closer you are to the substation, the better. Many times, in order to interconnect and tie into the utility's existing infrastructure, the solar project is going to require upgrades, possibly to both the distribution line, maybe even the substation, sometimes both. So if you're 5 miles away versus 1 mile away, and those costs are somewhere between $150 and $200 a foot to run a new line, that's going to make a big difference. So usually the closer you are to the substation, the better. Here's what a substation looks like. I'm sure many of you have seen these driving down the road. You probably don't even notice them anymore. But again, just substation, think higher voltage to lower voltage. And that's where everything starts. Once we've identified our substation, we want to, look at potential sites that are on or near the correct power lines. Here we're looking for distribution power lines coming out of the substation. So I went ahead and mapped those out for you guys. That's what you see in blue there on my screen. An ideal site would be power or electric lines that you plan on tying into. They would be right at the site. So you can see what kind of land in the area is kind of shaping up to be a decent site from that perspective. If we have to run a new distribution line half mile or a mile down the road just to connect into this blue area, that's not ideal for project costs. So like I said, when I'm looking for, land in certain markets, I want the power lines right on the property. So from left to right here, let me turn on my pointer here. This would be an example of a 3-phase or distribution power line. If you just count the top, 1, 2, 3, there's your 3-phase power. Community solar would likely tie into this. Your second example here, this is more of a transmission level line, higher voltage. Depending on the project, this would likely be what your utility scale project would tie into. And then I believe this would be a sub-transmission line. I'm not sure, but this was the best picture I could find with all 3 examples, I think. Different types of solar projects require different lines. Just something to be aware of. Very important. Do you have the right lines in the area? The next criteria I'd like to go through, is wetlands and floodplains. These areas in green and light green on my screen here are federally designated wetlands. Solar developers are typically they're going to want to avoid these areas. It's not that you cannot build solar in wetlands, you likely can, but laws may prevent solar companies from doing that. And typically it's going to be more of a headache, especially if you have to get the Army Corps involved. So we like to avoid wetlands where we can. I just don't want to add any more time to the development timeline if we don't have to. Next is topography. Avoiding bad topography is important. A potential site does not have to be completely flat, although, does it slope north? Does it slope south? I mean, that can make a big difference. This property here on my screen slopes a little bit to the south, which is great for solar since all the panels will be facing south. If the property is sloping north, again, that could be problematic, and the amount, how bad's the slope? Typically, we try to stay within 7% or less. If the property is sloping anywhere between, over 10%, that's going to be problematic, and it's going to require increased costs to the project due to the racking involved. So engineering does not appreciate it when I bring a potential site that has over a 7-8% slope for our company. Again, it's just a preference, but the higher you go, or the worse the topography gets, the more cost you're going to add to that project. So as developers, we will typically avoid bad topography if we can. Not sure if you noticed this, but we have a little airport near this potential site. It's not an international airport or a large airport by any means, but it is something that a developer is going to be aware of. I believe when a project is within 2 miles of a nearby runway, the FAA will get involved, and they're going to require a developer to do a glare study. From a land perspective, I like to avoid airports where I can. It's not a project killer, but if we can avoid them, I will. If you're within 2 miles of a runway, you'll just have to get the FAA involved and do that glare study. Okay, cell towers. This potential project has an existing cell tower right on the property. Not sure if any attorneys listening in today have negotiated cell tower agreements, but certain cell tower agreements that I've seen at least can be restrictive and may have language in the cell tower agreement that is not friendly to a potential solar developer. I'm not saying that all cell tower agreements are like that, but it's very similar to oil and gas leases already being in place, which we're going to get into it in a second. Solar developers are going to be aware of cell towers, and we're going to try to avoid them where we can. Otherwise, if a solar company approaches you and you have a cell tower on the property, don't be surprised if you get asked, for a copy of that agreement prior to executing, an agreement with the solar company. In my opinion, railroad easements, they can be used as a good buffer for solar projects. I always like to say, out of sight, out of mind. These blue arrows here on my screen point out a railroad on the northwest boundary of this property. I love this setup because it's a natural barrier, so to say. No one's going to be able to see, the project on the other side of the railroad tracks from that road. That could go a long way when it comes time for permitting. Another questions I get from landowners, sometimes, hey, I'm not on 3-phase, but maybe can we run a new line right across, the railroad tracks and connect right into the substation? In theory, you could do that. You have to get the utility on board to do that. But more importantly, you're going to have to get permission from that easement holder, likely the railroad, in order to cross over. So that could delay your development timeline, depending on how cooperative the railroad is. As Tom said, prior to making my transition into solar, I used to work in oil and gas for over 6 years in Southeast Ohio. One thing that I'm sure most of you are already aware of is Pennsylvania is an oil and gas heavy state. There's a lot of activity in the state or across the state, and solar developers need to be aware of that. And it's kind of hard to see on this map, but you'll just have to trust me. There were 3 shallow wells drilled in the 80s on this potential site. So do those existing leases have surface restriction clauses? The solar developer is likely going to want to enter into an MUA with the oil and gas lessee. The developer should be asking where the pipeline is located. How far back does the solar developer need to stay away from the wellhead or the pad sites? These are all questions that can be answered by the oil and gas lessee. And here's a map I'm sure you guys have seen before, but solar developers are going to try to stay out of the oil and gas areas if they can. That's going to be hard to do in Pennsylvania, but you can kind of see the areas that solar developers are going to have to try to figure out that oil and gas stuff. All right, quickly recapping this section. As far as land criteria, your proximity to the substation and the electric lines are very important. Avoid wetlands, floodplains, bad topography, and excessive shading from trees. You know, is there an airport within 2 miles? You know, are there any cell towers on the property? Avoid crossing over railroad easements if you can. I didn't mention this before, but I like to avoid cemeteries, golf courses, you know, larger residential neighborhoods. It just helps with permitting. The less, if you're not near those types of properties, I think it would be easier when it comes to permitting. Land criteria specific to Pennsylvania. Is the property in clean and green? Not a big deal if the property is in clean and green. The next question becomes, who is responsible for the property taxes, or what I call the rollback taxes? If you take the property out of clean and green, or a portion of the property out of clean and green, and put that into solar. Should the developer cover those taxes, or should the landowner? Is there a conservation easement on the property? The second question. I think this is huge. I'm running into quite a bit of conservation easements in many counties on the east side of the state near Philly. I believe the last one I ran into was in Chester County. If there's a conservation easement on the property, the solar developer will need to see a copy of that easement, and they might have to run title to find it. But it's very likely that solar will not be a permitted use. You know, for those conservation easements are typically just for that, conservation purposes, and they're going to limit development. Very important issue for Pennsylvania that solar developers are going to need to be aware of. And then again, is there any oil and gas activity in the area? Okay, structuring your agreement. Now let's discuss how developers may structure an agreement with the landowner. Here are 4 example solar projects. Again, let's just assume all of these are front of the meter where the power is going off-site. You have a ground mount project, again, very common. The parking canopy solar projects, these are my favorite. You know, when acreage gets tough to find, and you know, as you get closer to a city or a densely populated area, these projects can help you get that acreage. Same thing with the rooftop solar projects and the floating solar. I've never done a floating solar project or struck up that agreement, but it would be interesting. You know, can you lease a lake, or is that more of an easement? You know, very interesting. But the key takeaway here is not all solar projects are created equal when it comes to the type of agreement. Specifically, you know, what rights are being granted from the landowner to the developer or the lessee. You know, is the landowner granting the developer exclusive occupancy? Are the rights being granted? Are they permanent or temporary? You know, it's something that needs to be figured out. So again, ask yourself, what type of agreement is being proposed? Lease, an easement, or a license? And from the developer's perspective, can we finance the project? If we cannot insure and finance the project, the paperwork's not going to work. It's plain and simple. We need to be able to finance the project. So I want to just leave this up here for a couple seconds, but this kind of compares all 3 agreements. And I think the biggest one you're going to have a concern, well, the one you might have a concern with from the developer's perspective is the license. I think with a lease and an easement, those are generally going to be financeable, and we can probably get insurance on those. But a license, it's gonna be tricky. It just depends. But wanted to lay this out for you guys. For front of the meter ground mount solar projects, again in PA, most developers are likely going to want the landowner to sign a lease. So how do you structure that agreement? I believe there's 3 ways you can do that. You can option to lease with a term sheet attached. You can do an option to lease with the lease as an exhibit, and I'm going to show you guys that in a minute. And then you can jump right into the lease agreement that includes a due diligence or an option period. So I'm a visual person. I just kind of wanted to show these three examples kind of visually here. This is the option agreement where your exhibit A is going to be the legal description of the property. Your exhibit B is just a term sheet. So you guys are entering into an agreement saying, hey, here's all of our basic terms. Once the option is exercised by the solar developer, we will enter into a 30 or 60 day, negotiation period to finalize the lease. Personally, I think this is the weakest of the three setups. I would prefer, the second or third option here. The second option is where you have the same option agreement. Your exhibit A is your legal description for the property. Your exhibit B would be the depiction or the layout of the property. But notice that the exhibit C here is the actual lease. So think of this as two agreements and all wrapped into one. When the landowner signs the option agreement, they are agreeing to all of the lease terms in exhibit C as well. That way there's no confusion, like everything's done up front. Once the solar developer exercises the option, the parties can jump right into the lease and be done with it. There is no waiting around to negotiate the lease. But personally, I think this is the strongest setup, and this would be most common to the oil and gas community. Jump right into the lease with an option period or due diligence period baked in. Again, all three of these could work. It's just the preference of the developer. But here you have a lease with a built-in 3 or 5 year option period or due diligence period. The landowner signs this today, we can't start building the project tomorrow. It just doesn't happen that fast. So, just another way to structure it, but hopefully all that makes sense for you guys. Last section here, and I'm going to wrap this up. I want to quickly talk about legislation, developing, and permitting. So we talked about community solar. A community solar project, I'm going to define this a little more for you guys. It's an array of solar panels installed offsite. There's your key word, front of the meter. Anyone in the area or the electric utility territory can access the clean energy produced and receive credits towards their electricity bill. So let me give you an example. I'm here in Columbus, Ohio. I live in an apartment with my wife. We don't have the luxury of, our landlord's not going to allow us to put solar up on the roof of our building, and we don't really have a yard to do that either. So let's say a community solar project was built 20 or 30 minutes away, but was built inside the same utility territory that services my building. I could be a subscriber or sign up for that farm and save money on my electric bill every month. Even though I don't have it on site, I can sign up and save money that way. That's the idea behind community solar. Again, community solar is not available in Pennsylvania. I believe there's a little over 20 states across the country that have active community solar bills in place or programs in place. But Pennsylvania, and including Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, they do not have community solar yet. But there are a couple bills being proposed and discussed in Harrisburg. You guys can see a copy of my slides, but if you just get on Legiscan and look at, search community solar, you can kind of see all the bills being introduced and proposed. So when it comes to developing and permitting, one question the developer is going to have is, who is the AHJ? Who's going to give us the permits? Is it the state, the county, township, city? In New York, it's the township we're dealing with mostly, but when we went down for community solar in Virginia, we're dealing with the county. So it does depend on, you got to figure that out. Who's the AHJ? And then are there any additional federal or state permits required for your project? How does the local AHJ define, small scale versus large scale? Sometimes in their local ordinance, they may say a small scale site is defined as 1 acre or less, everything else is large. So then you got to figure out which rules apply to which type of project. Can you develop in the zone or the zoning district that you're in? What are the setback requirements? Are there any lot restrictions? For example, one ordinance I looked at in Chester County recently, it said you can't do more than 50% of the parcel. So if you have 50 acres, most you can do on that site is 25. That's your starting point, according to the local AHJ. Are there tree screening requirements? Sometimes the AHJ will require the solar developer to put up some trees on a well-traveled road to kind of block that. And does the AHJ prohibit development in any other way? Going back to that Chester County example, I just recently ran into an ordinance out there that said no solar is allowed on prime farmland soils class 1 and 2. Very, very specific, very restrictive though, in a way. So just another thing we had to go over, but having all of this in front of us right away helps us select the best sites, if that makes sense. As far as development, is there a decommissioning plan required? At Forefront, we put the decommissioning clause and a bond inside of our agreements. We handle that all up front with the landowner. But if the AHJ requires one, we'll work that out. That whatever we need to do to get our permits, we just want the landowners and the community to know that we are aware of the decommissioning concerns, and we want to make sure that we handle that and address that in the actual paperwork. And does the AHJ allow for battery storage? I think battery storage is going to be one of the key drivers for solar and wind in the future, and the electric grid in general. So, you can build a solar project now, but can you add batteries 5-10 years from now? Does the AHJ allow for that? All right, let's wrap this up. What can cause a solar project to be tabled? If you have an option or a lease in place, what would cause a solar developer like Forefront just to walk away? The lack of local legislation, that's a big problem in a lot of states. We go into an area, we get an option agreement signed, we talk to the utility, they're on board, and we go to get permits, and there's no local legislation in place. Very, very important. I can't stress that enough. And one of the biggest reasons we walk away from projects is the lack of interconnection or unfavorable results from the utility, where the expenses or the cost to upgrade the existing infrastructure are just too high. Sometimes changes in the state and local legislation can cause us to walk away, and that typically might impact project economics. Last slide here, local opposition can be and should be addressed by the solar developer. Some issues we hear, like down in Virginia, the property is no longer being used for agriculture. Well, okay, we can address that with something called dual use agriculture, sheep grazing inside that system. That's one way we can jump ahead in an area and address that concern. Solar is loud or noisy. Well, not really, but a developer could run a test and prove against that. Some opposition, like I said, we hear they don't want to look at it. Well, that's fine. Well, maybe we can put up a natural tree barrier, tuck it back, get it out of sight, out of mind, like I was talking about. Again, that goes a long way. And then I think the most important concern is the decommissioning. If you address that with the landowner and the town or the local governing body, that's going to go a long way as far as local opposition is concerned. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alyssa.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me today. Thanks to Penn State for inviting me. And thanks, Phillip, for a great presentation. You'll see that community and utility size solar, we do have some of the same issues, but I'm going to be presenting exclusively on utility scale or large scale solar. So, that's projects that are, 100 megawatts or more. For my company, Lightsource BP, we're looking at, projects that range from really like 100 to even, I think our largest project right now is around 350 megawatts. So obviously a lot more land is required. So we have a whole different sort of focus on issues. So today I'm going to talk about low conflict solar. And I have a really packed slide deck for you all. But I'm going to focus on sort of these 5 topics. The first is just a quick introduction to Lightsource BP, 2 minutes, shameless introduction to the company. I do want to talk for a minute about the US and state climate goals and policy, and just sort of level set for a little bit about what our future in the US could look like, and emphasis on could, because there's a lot of obvious uncertainty around legislation and policy, but definitely there are certain trends we should recognize. Most of this talk will be about solar integration on the landscape for utility size projects. I will talk a lot about dual land use opportunities because in my role as Vice President of Environmental Affairs for Lightsource BP, I lead our sustainability program, and we are doing just a lot of really cool and emerging work in this space. So I'd like to talk to you about that and how it really connects with social licensing. And then lastly, I just can't help but talk about a solar symposium that's going on in December, just to make everyone aware of it if you're interested in learning more about these topics. The American Wind and Wildlife Institute is doing a solar symposium, but it's really fascinating, and I'm going to just spend a couple of minutes on that. Okay, so just talking a little bit right now about Lightsource BP. We've been around for about 10 years, starting in Europe. We have about 3 gigawatts of operating projects in 14 countries. We have a 16 gigawatt global project development pipeline and about 500 members worldwide. We do have a sustainability framework for our company. I won't get into it, but it really has 3 pillars. It's people, the environment, and energy. And that really sets the basis for really all of the development and operational work that we do in solar. In the US, we're pretty new. We entered the US market in 2017. And as the name suggests, we are a 50-50 JV with BP, the oil super major turned integrated energy company. And right now we're active in 21 states across the US, including my home state, Pennsylvania, which I will focus on. We have about 9+ gigawatts of projects in our portfolio. We have about 2.7 gigawatts of executed power contracts with clients in 10 states. And by the way, those clients are not just the traditional utilities. They are tech companies, people in the or big players in the commercial space, even government entities. So our clients, as opposed to maybe 10-15 years ago, the client base looks totally different now. At Lightsource, we have about 1 gigawatt currently under construction, and in the US, we have about 90 people in our company. Okay, so I just want to tell you a little bit about the projects that we have going on in Pennsylvania. Some of these should be familiar, at least to the Penn State folks. We have one bucket of projects called the Whitetails, but I think you guys at Penn State call them Nittany 1, 2, and 3. And that's an arrangement between Penn State and Lightsource BP, where these 3 projects that total 72 megawatts, they're all in Franklin County. It'll power 25% of all Penn State University campuses, and it's going to save the university $14 million in electricity bills over the contract term. I think the contract term is 25 years. So we started, they're all in operation. We began operating them in September 2020. We also have another bucket of projects that we call the Elk Hills. They're 46 megawatts, also located in Franklin County. And anybody who lives in Philadelphia or familiar with Philadelphia knows about SEPTA. SEPTA is our offtake. These projects will provide about 20% of SEPTA's $380,000 megawatt hour per year electricity demand. Now, I know I just said that our projects are typically pretty over 100 megawatts. These projects are sort of our earlier ones, so they're smaller, but definitely the trend is, towards bigger projects. And then the next bucket of projects that we have, we call them the Cottontails. and they are 8 projects across central PA. And these are really, really interesting because these are part of Governor Wolf's PULSE program. PULSE stands for Project to Utilize Light and Solar Energy. And these are 191 megawatts, and we expect these will be operational by December 2020. And when they're complete, it will provide clean power to 16 Commonwealth of Pennsylvania agencies. So ultimately, you know, Pennsylvania is sourcing about 50% of its annual energy consumption from renewable energy. And what makes this really cool is this is the largest solar commitment of any government in the U.S. announced to date. So in Pennsylvania, we should be really proud of that. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about climate trends and legislation. And many of you, I'm sure, have probably seen this in the news. But I'll just go quickly. You know, the Biden administration. It's no secret that labor, climate, and social justice are priorities, and actually, the way the Biden administration is dealing with those issues is actually conflating them because climate and clean, renewable energy, jobs, environmental justice, all these things really are sort of under a big banner for them. So, just a couple things that I wanted to point out about where this presidential administration is going. I'm sure all of you have seen in the news that we rejoined the Paris Agreement. That's one of the first things that President Biden did when he came into office in 2021. So we are there on the national stage again. In April, the Biden administration assembled what they called the National Climate Task Force, and it declared its goal to cut greenhouse gas emissions to half of their 2005 levels by the end of the decade, and then reach net zero by 2050. That was a proclamation, from our government. It's not baked into legislation, but it's something that, we've committed to, within our country and also, on the global scale. And so, as you can expect, a lot of experts and universities have really thought through, okay, what will it take to meet those goals in the US? And there's a lot of resources on this, but one I just, pulled out here, a bunch of energy experts at Princeton released this report called Net Zero America. And basically, through their modeling, they say that such an endeavor will require about 227,000 square miles of America to be blanketed in wind and solar. So that's roughly equal to the size of a whole bunch of states put together. So the reason why I put that in there is because, just to sort of visualize, in order to meet our climate goals, we have a lot of work to do, and it's going to take up a lot of land. So that's something to consider as, we think about low conflict solar. Also, just, from a legislative perspective, I'm sure a lot of you read in the press about the infrastructure bill. The Biden administration calls its infrastructure plan the American Jobs Plan, again, sort of conflating these issues that are very important to the administration. And the industry, the solar industry, and the Biden administration is working tirelessly, I'll say, on issues that are really important to us, like tax incentives, domestic panel manufacturing, transmission infrastructure, and a national clean energy standard. So, it's, I guess, remains to be seen what happens in the infrastructure bill. But know that, climate is, poised to play a really big role in how that infrastructure bill gets rolled out. And then also with respect to Pennsylvania, Governor Tom Wolf had a climate change executive order, and he proclaimed that Pennsylvania greenhouse gas emissions would be reduced 26% by 2025 and 80% by 2050, compared again, like the national level or national standard with 2005 levels, and then obtaining at least 40% of electricity from in-state clean energy sources. So we have a lot of work to do in Pennsylvania and in the US. So considering how much solar is going to be required on the landscape, both here in Pennsylvania and throughout the US, it begs the question, what is a successful solar integration, and what does it look like? So, I laid out 6 items here that I'm going to go into, 6 topics that are industry best practices. And, I've been in the renewables business, wind and solar, for almost 17 years. And these are things that, in my experience, and believe me, I've had a lot of experiences, both positive and negative. These 6 that I have listed on the slide are really, are critical. So I'm going to jump right into them. So the first item on my list for successful integration is no or low conflict siting using best-in-class publicly available data on species, natural resources, land designations. I mean, the goal is to identify, low conflict locations. And Phillip got into a lot of this because this pertains to community solar, which takes up obviously much less space, but also commercial. So, what is so important as developers, whether you're greenfielding, so you're prospecting, you're looking for new sites, or we're looking at other, other projects that other developers have started, it's critical that, we hit on, it's amazing what's available publicly, right? So it's, some of the things that Phillip hit on, you want flat, contiguous land, floodplains. We always try to avoid floodplains, wetlands and water resources as a best practice. Always best, to avoid putting infrastructure in those resources. If you do, you want to avoid and minimize to the greatest extent possible. Nat cap exposure is an enormous issue with utility size solar. So, particularly with the impacts of climate change, weather and tornadoes and snow load. And it's pretty, just look at what happened in Texas not too long ago. Weather has an enormous impact on energy generation facilities. So, we need to understand what that exposure can look like. Federal Aviation Administration for large utility size projects, glare is, it's not a deal breaker, but it's something that we need to address to make sure we're not endangering any aircraft. Housing density, best to stay away from areas with high housing density. The land cover is critical. Forested land cover and threatened endangered species, species that require special consideration, farmland designations. This is really, and this isn't even probably the entire list of all the things that as a developer, we need to make sure that we are accounting for all of these factors in putting and citing solar projects appropriately. So once we go through sort of the desktop or best publicly available process, and we identify sites that we think are going to be suitable for solar, we get into site-specific environmental surveys. Now, there's tons of other site-specific surveys we're going to do for construction, constructability, things like that, but I'm just going to focus on sort of the environmental space. And I've listed out here for you the things that, I would say are baseline best management practices. And really, Lightsource BP does this, but I work so closely with so many large scale solar developers in the industry. We're in all kinds of coalitions. We collaborate all the time. This is really like industry best practice. All the major solar developers, they're going to do a phase 1 environmental site assessment for hazardous waste and CERCLA liability, habitat land use study, also very standard. So for example, if you have a site that may have nesting habitat, you need to get out there with a certified biologist and make sure that when you start construction, that there are not nesting avian species, but particularly raptors and eagles. And if there are, you need to have the appropriate setbacks, and you need to, function within your construction activities within the proper season. If the publicly available data showed that there may be the potential presence of threatened or endangered species, we need to make sure we do an on-the-ground study there. Wetlands and waterway delineations, that just goes without saying. If we're going to avoid these resources, we need to know where they are, and we need to make sure we permit them appropriately, whether they are U.S. jurisdictional waters under the control of the Army Corps of Engineers, or whether there's state designated waters. Completely depends on what state you're working in. And then, the last things, cultural resources are really important as well. So, we want to make sure that, an area can look totally fine from, just a simple site walk and some desktop assessments, but doing a cultural resource survey and shovel testing is really important too, to make sure that there is nothing there that our project and our construction activities will not disturb anything of cultural or archaeological significance. I can't overstate how important that is. And then we always do a visual and sound assessment. I think Phillip mentioned that solar projects don't make a lot of noise. They don't, but often is a requirement for counties or townships. They ask for that, so it's pretty standard. And then lastly, regulatory agency consultation. So, it's just a best practice to consult with your particularly with your wildlife regulatory agencies. It's U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and then whatever state you're working in, the appropriate wildlife agencies, to make sure that, they don't have any information that isn't publicly available, or they don't have any suggestions for best practices or avoidance and minimization measures for species of concern. So, here's just sort of best management practices that we try to implement for construction and operations. So, after you do your siting, then you do your site-specific surveys, and then how does construction and operation look like, right? So once we get all the information for projects, I probably won't read every single one of these, so please read at your leisure. But probably the most important best management practice is to avoidance, really, pure avoidance and setbacks from sensitive or valuable habitat. I think all developers know, and this is just a code of conduct, previously disturbed land at project sites, use that land as much as possible. I mentioned earlier about, if any habitat needs to be removed, you want to make sure you remove that outside of species breeding seasons as appropriate. Invasive plant species, anybody who's ever, owned and operated a utility scale project knows how important it is to manage invasive plant species. So there's standard practices for construction and operation to make sure that we are, reducing the spread of invasive species on your project site. Some of you may be familiar with APLIC, that's the Avian and Powerline Interaction Committee. They have recommendations on power lines and electrical infrastructure to avoid collisions and electrocution from power lines. You know, just to clarify here, that solar projects and direct impacts to avian species is not common. It's very rare. In fact, less rare than most anthropogenic structures, but we do want to make sure that our power lines have the appropriate bird flight diverters and infrastructure to make sure that we avoid electrocution and collision when we put up power lines. And I'll just say the last thing here is to develop environmental management plans. We do that at Lightsource BP. We document and track sustainability commitments and you know, site-specific environmental requirements. Okay, so moving away from, you know, from the BMPs and sort of how do we set up a project. Social licensing, everybody knows this, so important. You know, how do we engage and integrate the community with stakeholders? And anyone in development knows you need to do it early and you need to do it often. And you know, there's so many stakeholder benefits for and surrounding solar projects. So, you know, sort of the obvious one is jobs, right? Solar projects create hundreds of jobs during construction, and then additional jobs during the operational life of projects. So, I mean, this is what the Biden administration is talking about when they're integrating, you know, climate solutions and climate goals and jobs and environmental justice. Solar projects also offer tax revenue. So solar farms contribute, you know, millions of dollars in property tax revenue. This can benefit, you know, depending on, you know, the townships and the counties we're working with and how they want to utilize these funds. You know, it could benefit schools, fire departments, basically any kind of public service. You know, one thing that I think goes overlooked a lot is the diversified revenue for landowners. So, you know, particularly those in the farming community, you know, we have seen just countless stories of how solar facilities provide, you know, additional reliable revenue for landowners and truly for generations of their families. And this is really, really important to diversify revenue streams, particularly in agricultural communities. I could talk for hours about the stories around that. You know, educational opportunities for Lightsource BP. We like to have our solar farms as living labs. Another thing I could talk about forever, but I won't, but we have a lot going on with Penn State. And we have a bunch of research actually happening, you know, here in Pennsylvania and in other states with different research entities, and there's just a lot to learn from these projects. And then philanthropic commitments. So, you know, when we get into communities, developers want to consider, you know, charitable donations or involvement, you know, with local organizations. So I won't get into too much about this, but this is an example of an organization that Lightsource BP is involved with. It's called Grid Alternatives. Basically, what this organization does is take individuals from under-resourced and underserved communities and train them on utility-sized solar projects like ours, Lightsource BP. This is an example of some work that we did on a 300 megawatt project in Colorado. Grid Alternatives was able to bring in a number of individuals and do job training on our project site, and then those individuals were able to go on and work not just in solar but in other types of related industries. So, you know, again, this almost goes back to this whole, you know, living lab idea. So the next thing is really, you know, how are we managing the end of project life for solar facilities? Because, our power purchase agreements are, maybe around, 25, 30 years, sometimes more. And so I'm not going to read everything here because I want to be conscious of time, but there are a number of mechanisms for recycling PV panels. They typically consist of glass, aluminum, copper, silver, and semiconductor materials, and they can be recovered and reused. 80% of a panel is glass and aluminum, so we all know that those are easily recyclable. The Solar Energy Industry Association, which is our most active trade association in the solar industry, they have a PV recycling program, and that's one that companies like Lightsource BP rely on as well. And truthfully, as the industry grows, we will become more technologically advanced in the issues of recycling, but it's a high priority and very, very important for our projects. Decommissioning is another thing that we commit to for all of our projects, removing any above ground and below ground mechanical equipment, wiring, structural components. Almost always that is baked into, I shouldn't say that, many times it's baked into permitting and county or township requirements. Okay, this is one thing, quickly, I just want to myth bust for a second about solar panel safety. I get this question all the time. A lot of people ask if solar panels are toxic to the environment, and there is a test that EPA administers under RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. It's called the TCLIP, Toxicity Characteristic Leaching Procedure. And, I can speak for Lightsource BP that all panels that we use pass this test. And this test is to determine if panels will leach in landfills and thus also on the landscape. And all of the panels that we use pass the TCLIP test. Okay, so I'm just going to finish up by talking about dual land use for solar. Like I said, this is really an important aspect of social licensing, agricultural integration. Solar, just to level set for a second, solar puts, it temporarily sets aside land, right? And it protects it from loss due to industrialization. It rests the ground. Takes it out of agricultural production, and of course there's a whole rejuvenation process that obviously the landscape will go through when it's removed from other types of activities for 30 years. Remember that the infrastructure, the footprint is actually very light, and the land underneath the solar panels goes untouched for however long, let's say 30 years, right? So right there, in many ways, solar is conservation, is land conservation. But what we look to do is also add on other ecosystem services. So sort of two buckets of that. One is a term that is used a lot, agrivoltaics. It's the combination of agriculture and solar, and then other types of habitat conservation and food production. And this is very, very much an emerging space. And here on this slide, I just sort of listed out, the things that we're working on at Lightsource BP, and the industry at large is also working on for dual land use initiatives for solar. Sheep grazing is basically using sheep to manage the vegetation that otherwise would be removed using mostly mowers. Pollinator habitat, big hot topic right now. That's the installation of pollinator habitat underneath and around the arrays. Habitat conservation, depending where you are. And in Colorado, we are installing shortgrass prairie habitat on over 4,000 acres of between two solar projects there. And by maintaining that habitat, we've got shortgrass prairie for the next 30 years. A lot of people probably know about bees on solar projects. And so at Lightsource BP, we're doing that, mostly in a research setting. There's some, questions about conservation on native and honeybees, and then, food crops. It's very much an emerging space, and we really hope to implement that at Lightsource BP. The reason why, we implement these dual land use considerations, sometimes our local permitting asks us to. They ask us to put in pollinators. They ask us to do sheep grazing. Sometimes the conservation community asks us, or regulators. Now, that's not a regulatory requirement usually, but we get those recommendations. And then also, like I said, this can be a really critical piece of integrating into local communities and reducing social resistance. There's actually, DOE has a solar energy technology office. They did a whole study on land competition and social resistance. That just came out in 2021. And it was a study of, I think, 8 or 10 different developers and different communities. And it came to the conclusion that, yes, in fact, these types of, agrivoltaics, dual land use strategies really does reduce social resistance and helps projects integrate into the community. Here's an example, just the whitetail project that we're doing with Penn State, a really good example of combining agrivoltaics and habitat conservation. We are implementing sheep grazing, which will start, could be August, but should be this July. We have a landowner adjacent to our Whitetail 1 project, 500 sheep that he is going to be grazing at the project site to manage vegetation. This farmer is not a landowner. He's an adjacent landowner, and he will be paid for, through a contractual arrangement to provide the vegetation management on the project site. So a diversified revenue stream for this landowner. And we've also installed habitat that we call Fuzz and Buzz. So it's an Ernst seed mix. So as the name suggests, the fuzz is for sheep and the buzz is for pollinators. And this is just a couple of pictures. This on the left here, I know it's not that pretty, but that's an example of a stream bank and forested area that we will conserve on through our lease arrangements on a project we have in Texas. The upper right-hand side is that shortgrass prairie I mentioned, and on the bottom right, this is a high-value pollinator garden. That's all milkweed plants that are going in on a project site of ours in California. There are some challenges with dual land use opportunities. I probably won't get into these because I know my time is running short, but as ambitious as we are and as much as we want to implement pollinator habitat, agrivoltaics, and other types of conservation, there are constraints related to costs, viability, insurance, vegetation height, things like that. So as an industry, we're working towards that. I'm going to skip over this. And then the last slide here is just about that solar symposium I was mentioning. American Wind and Wildlife Institute, I know it says wind, but they are expanding into solar. They are a group that, I've worked with for years, not directly affiliated at the moment, but they are basically, trying to assess the state of the science. If you see the little diagram in the middle, you can see many stakeholders will be involved, including Argonne Lab, NREL, other departments at Department of Energy, federal and state agencies, universities, the conservation community. And this is going to be occurring in December 2021. So if you Google it and you're interested in learning more about wildlife and habitat conservation, land management and use, just a whole suite of environmental issues, feel free to tune into that. And that's it. Thanks, everyone.
Alyssa, thank you. And Phillip, thank you as well. On the questions, we were hoping to have a little bit of time to do Q&A. We've actually exceeded our time, but I think Phillip had jumped in and was answering a lot of the questions on the run there. So Phillip, thank you for doing that. Alyssa, I just want to take one more minute before we turn it over to Ross, who's going to talk about the CLEs, and ask you one question that we get quite often, and I'm sure that Phillip gets the same question. And that's about the swapping out of technology. You see with the advent of new technology coming out of labs that somewhere midstream in the 20-year cycle that you would swap out equipment that's already on the ground, solar equipment that's already on the ground, meaning panels, not transformers and such.
Yeah.
Or once you hit the 20-year moment, do you see it likely that you'll go back in and re-up for another 20 years? Can you give us just a really quick take on that?
Yeah, so my quick take is that I would look back to how the wind industry has done this, and so if you think back to wind, utility scale wind, going back 20 some years, through advances in technology, it's created blades that are more efficient, can create more electricity, are lighter, a whole host of other improvements, right? And so, for years, I've worked for companies where we went in and we retrofitted projects, right? And it made sense because if you increase the electrical output and you add in more efficient technology, it's worth, the cost is worth it. So maybe, let's say you're 10 years into your contract, and undoubtedly, right, there's so much R&D going on. You have, solar technology that's more advanced, and I can absolutely see a retrofitting happening. And like I said, it would be worth it because, you would recoup those costs through, the more efficient electricity production. As for, what happens in, 20, 30 years from now, it's really hard to predict. The markets, I don't know what the markets are going to be like. I hope that our government has, by that time, put in some really strong, legislative and, mechanisms for clean energy. So I think, the future is just really only a massive increase in, clean renewable energy, whatever technological form that takes.
Okay, Alyssa, Phillip, thank you both for joining us today. I think it's been very instructive. It really added a nice component to the discussion we've been having. You really can't have this discussion in total until you bring in the perspective of the industry, and you've both done a great job in doing that. So thank you for joining us here today. One thing that I will mention to the listeners is we'll likely circle back in one of the upcoming sessions we'll do going forward, and we'll invite Alyssa and Phillip and others from the industry to come back and dig into this in a little bit more nuance. So again, thank you to both of you for joining us here today.